Greetings and salutations. It is Monday, October 3rd at DSK, your friendly neighborhood Spencer man. Keyboard Kimura podcast. A little later in the day than I normally do this. Rocking the new setup, rocking the new computer, the new mic, the new everything. So hopefully this sounds even better than the last ones have. Shout out to the fine people at Long and McQuaid for hooking me up. Shouts to the people at Apple for the lovely new computer. Shouts to my wife for letting me take over 2 rooms to build things and work from home like this. Little later in the day, as I said, than I normally would do this. I had some errands to run this morning. I had some interviews to line up and to do and some work to get through. But I also was putting in the work trying to fulfill one of Harry's requests. So if you listened to the Next Day Takeaways that myself and Harry did on Sunday, coming out of UFC Vegas 61, we talked about, and previously we often talk about sort of how we would match make some of these divisions and some of the struggles that are happening in these divisions right now. And so I messaged him this morning and said, I think I'm going to take a rip at figuring out strawweight, going off of Yan Xiaonan's win over Mackenzie Dern. And he messaged back with one word, and that word was middleweight. And I said, it's really tough. And he said, that's why I want you to do it. So because I'm a sucker, and because I like building spreadsheets, and because I like trying to accomplish these things, I spent a good part of my morning trying to figure out sort of the next steps. If I was playing Sean Shelby, Mick Maynard, Dana White, how I would map out the middleweight division. And before I started recording this, as I got set up here, I messaged Harry and I was like, I actually can't do it. It's sort of impossible to do right now because of the state of the division. And he said, well, that's your podcast. And so here we are, sort of going to go through sort of both sides of that. We're going to try to match make it a little bit, and we're going to do it a little bit on the fly here as we go. But I'm also just going to walk you through some of the challenges, some of what's happening right now in the division. I have it up beside me on my screen here, which is why you see me glancing sideways regularly, and not making better eye contact with you, fine viewers. The challenge is something that we talked about a few weeks back when Robert Whittaker fought Marvin Vettori. And that is that there's just too many of those types of fights, right? Too many fights. I called them go nowhere fights, do nothing fights, where Rob Whittaker goes out and gets a good win over Marvin Vettori. It is a meaningful win. It is a good victory, but it doesn't move Robert Whittaker anywhere. It leaves Marvin Vettori. He doesn't really lose ground because he lost to the second best fighter in the division. And so he's still very much a top 10 fighter in the division, a top 5 fighter in the division for that matter. But we don't really have any room to move some of these athletes, and sort of trying to figure out what comes next for these men is exceedingly difficult. So at the top of the division, we have Israel Adesanya, obviously, who has a title fight coming up November 12th at UFC 281 against Alex Pereira. Izzy's 23-0 at middleweight. And if he wins that fight, he will have beaten the next 6 people in line in the division, which is a sign of dominance, but it also becomes difficult because then you're into sort of the same territory we were in back when Demetrius Johnson was dominating flyweight, where you get down to, or that Valentina Shevchenko is in now currently at flyweight, where you get down to the fighter that is at number 6 or number 7 or number 8 in the rankings being the next best option, because I don't think we need to see any of these rematches yet. We don't need to see a third fight between Adesanya and Whittaker. The second fight happened earlier this year. We don't need to see a rematch between Cannonier. He hasn't fought yet. He's got a fight coming up with Sean Strickland in December. Vettori's lost to him twice. Derek Brunson lost to him a while ago. He has a fight coming up. Paulo Costa's lost to him. And so you see the struggle. And so in mapping it out, in writing out sort of what the division may look like, and bouncing the ideas off Harry, because he is the person to bounce ideas off of now, I said, can Jack Hermanson get a title opportunity off victories over Chris Curtis and Derek Brunson? And I kind of think the answer is yes. I mean, it's not necessarily ideal. You would like to see him beat someone in the top 5, in the top, further ahead of him in the mix than he's at. But 1, some of those fighters are booked. 2, it doesn't do us any good to put Jack Hermansson in there, should he get a victory in his fight coming up against Derek Brunson in December, on December 3rd, to then put him in there against Robert Whittaker. Because as I talked about back when Rob's fight was coming up, and as I've talked about time and again for different divisions, we don't need to put everybody through the Robert Whittaker gauntlet, through the Robert Whittaker meat grinder, through the Max Holloway meat grinder at featherweight, as we've seen. And so if you're Jack Hermansson, the aim and the goal needs to be to go out and make a statement against Derek Brunson, because it could mean, if Israel Adesanya retains, his title on November 12th, that you're the next man up. You're just next in line. You are the Chris Carriasso, the Ray Borg of the middleweight division in 2022. Now, further looking at the division and sort of trying to further identify some of the problems, some of the challenges, some of what creates this situation. Part of it is that there just haven't been the young, exciting, emerging fighters to come through the division that we see in so many other weight classes, right? Lightweight seems to, every year there's 1 or 2 fighters that work their way into the top 15 and gain some momentum and work their way up. And at the same time, there's a couple people working their way backwards that are sliding down the rankings, and we get some turnover, and we get some, the splits and the chasms in terms of the level of talent and the level of competition isn't as great. So 1 to, let's say, 12, they can be a little more tightly packed, and it doesn't take a lot. You can see sort of number 9 beat number 3, or number 4 lose to number 7. And that creates some changeover, that creates some turnover, that creates some different opportunities where we haven't seen that at middleweight, right? Nobody can get through Rob Whittaker. And then beyond that, Jared Cannonier is a pretty damn good bronze medalist right now. And Marvin Vettori has been a pretty steady presence in that top 5. And so it's just been a lot of moving one step ahead. And we see that even coming up for Nasruddin Imavov, who is one of the few young fighters that has had some success. He's on a 3-fight winning streak, coming off a win in Paris over Joaquin Buckley. And his reward, I guess, is to face Kelvin Gastelum. And it's an interesting fight. It's a competitive fight. I think the world of Kelvin Gastelum as a competitor. But when you're in a division where there is a dearth of fresh young talent, putting one of those athletes in there with Kelvin Gastelum off 2 straight losses, off a lengthy layoff, having already lost to Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker and Jared Cannonier in his career, feels like a mistake to me. Because if Kelvin Gastelum wins, you don't get anything from it. And if Nasruddin Imavov wins, it's still not enough necessarily to carry him into a championship opportunity. And so then it's still 1, maybe 2 more fights that he's got to win, which then doesn't do too much. And that fight would probably be one of those names I mentioned, right? Whittaker, Cannonier, Vettori, Paulo Costa, perhaps. And then it's still just sameness. It's the same as Dricus du Plessis, who is undefeated in the UFC and on a 5-fight winning streak overall, getting paired off with Darren Till, who himself, like Gastelum, is coming in on a 2-fight losing streak, coming in off a lengthy layoff. They're set to fight December 10th. And as much as I understand the UFC always sort of being behind Darren Till and always looking to elevate and promote and give Darren Till opportunities, Darren Till has lost to some of these guys in this division already, right? He's already faced and lost to Robert Whittaker. And so if you can't beat the silver medalist, how are we going to necessarily elevate you to face the gold medalist? Now, we've seen that happen, right? We've seen that happen in different divisions, and it's a thing that that may be the way the UFC needs to go in this division. And I would argue it is the way the UFC needs to go in this division. You need to stop running everybody through Robert Whittaker. You need to adopt the same sort of approach that has been taken at flyweight with Valentina Shevchenko, where not everybody has to get through Caitlin Chikagian, who is the silver medalist there. And it's just, you get 2 wins, you get 3 wins, in you go. We saw that with Tyler Santos. We saw it with Jen Maya before. Alexa Grasso could be in that position if she goes out and beats Viviane Araujo in the next UFC main event in a couple of weeks' time, 12 days' time. And I think that's what the UFC needs to do here at middleweight. And so to me, that means an Izzy win in New York at Madison Square Garden, coupled with a Jack Hermanson win on December 3rd, means Joker gets a title shot. Just do it. It's the only thing, honestly, that makes sense going forward, because outside of Paulo Costa, he's the only fighter in the top 10 coming off a win. Excuse me. Andre Muniz is as well, but that's a win over Uriah Hall. That wasn't that impressive. And I think Andre Muniz becomes the guy that you pair off with Robert Whittaker, because he's done so much, because he's been so successful in the UFC. You give him that big step up, that big test. And it's a huge test. I would love to advocate for Andre Muniz getting a title shot right now, but I think he's going to end up being the guy that's in the position where he's got to go through the Robert Whittaker meat grinder, because the UFC doesn't necessarily seem as invested in Andre Muniz. Nobody else is really rushing to call him out or to create that opportunity. And so he may end up being the dude that fights Rob Whittaker at some point. Now, one name that I haven't mentioned thus far that obviously is the elephant in the room, and that's Khamzat Chimaev. So he went out a couple weeks ago and he beat Kevin Holland to remain undefeated for his career and undefeated in the UFC. And it seems like middleweight is probably where he's going next, right? He blew weight for what was going to be the Nathan Diaz fight. Everything gets reshuffled at UFC 279. And he gets into this fight with Kevin Holland, and it is what it is. And so the question is, what do you do with Khamzat Chimaev if he's at middleweight? You could, in theory, just put him in there with Israel Adesanya should Izzy retain his title. Now, I personally wouldn't, given all of what happened last time out. I think it's a little bit strange. It's a little bit rushed. It's a little bit too big of a reward for somebody that submarined your plans to just go out there and get a title fight right away. And so I think you stick him in there with Paulo Costa. And you just say, look, you got to go out there. You got to beat this guy. They had some beef at that event. They had some, or at some point in the last little while, they've had some beef. You put that as the co-main event on a pay-per-view card, or the third fight on a pay-per-view card, or the main event of a fight night show. You build it up as if this guy wins, then he gets the next title shot, and away you go. But there's even problems with that, right? Like Chimaev is one of these guys. He's got relationships with Darren Till as the Smesh brothers. There's been talk of Robert Whittaker, and he said, nah, I don't want to fight him. I respect him. We're friends. We're brothers. I'd rather train with him than fight him, which, you know, is sound business. It's a good business decision. I wouldn't want to fight Robert Whittaker. But he's sort of the guy that can potentially change some of this, right? He can be that new young name, fresh name that hasn't fought any of these guys that you can put in there. But the key then beyond that, the key behind all of that, and this is the most important part, is bringing along the Imavovs, the Muniz, the Duplessis. Brendan Allen got a third straight win on Saturday. Bringing along a fighter like that. Bringing along a fighter like Kyle Bahayo, who has a fight at UFC 280 against Mahmoud Muradov. And if he wins that one, to pick up his third straight UFC win and extend his overall winning streak to 10, you've got to elevate him and give him some opportunities to move forward. Roman Dolidze has won 2 straight fights. If he beats Phil Hawes at the end of October, you've got to move him forward. It can't just be these little baby steps in this division, because it's a division that doesn't have room for people to be taking baby steps. It doesn't have time for the UFC to just slow play all of these fighters. Abus Magomedov came out a couple weeks ago with a phenomenal debut. First round knockout, kicks Dustin Stoltzfus in the face. looks like the genuine article. 3 straight wins. I believe he's 32 years old. There's no need to slow play this. Get him in there with, you know, somebody in that Brad Tavares range. Now, Brad has a fight. BT has a fight coming up in January against Gregory Rodriguez, which I understand. But like, it needs to be someone like that. There doesn't need to be this like, well, let's wait and see and have him beat 2 or 3 fighters in the middle of this division before we get going forward. Because right now things are just so stale. There needs to be this new blood. And it's really the same idea that trickles down to Bo Nickal, who obviously goes out last Tuesday, gets his second win on the Contender Series, gets his 3rd victory overall, makes it look easy, right? Lovely left hand to drop Donovan Beard, chases him to the ground, eventually ends up with a triangle choke finish. He's matched up in December against Jamie Pickett, which basically is a 3rd straight Contender Series fight. Jamie Pickett has struggled in the UFC, came off the Contender Series, fought there 3 times. He's had as many fights on the Contender Series as he's had in the UFC. I think maybe he's had 4 fights in the UFC now. But it's pretty assuredly going to be a win for Bo Nickal. There's just no need for this to be 3, 4, 5 fights to run Bo Nickal slowly up the rankings and get him these wins over, Dulce Longiambula or Josh Fremd or Bruno Silva at some point. And I'm just picking names that I have here on my list in front of me. Dennis Tiulian. Like, there's no need for Bo Nickal at this point to be doing that. I'm not saying throw him right in there in the top 5, but put him in there in true test situations. Put him in there in fights that are going to tell us and give us a better understanding of where his skills are at and where he fits in this division right now, so that if he is the absolute genuine article and ready to compete with the top 5 fighters in the world and in the division, as he says he is, we get there now when we need a fighter of this caliber, when we need this kind of energy and influx of excitement in this division. Don't stretch this out so that it ends up being 2 years. Let him beat Jamie Pickett. Fine. That fight is booked. It's set December 10th, UFC 282. Bo Nickal wins his UFC debut. Calling it on October 3rd. After that, give him a step up. Give him somebody that might be able to test him in some of these areas. Give him Gerald Meerschaert. GM3 is a really great test, actually, in my opinion, for a guy like Bo Nickal, right? He's got 40, maybe 50 fights. Good submission fighter, good on the ground, able to catch you, got some durability, got a little bit of pop in his hands, but isn't throwing him in there with Rob Whittaker, right? Isn't throwing him in there with Marvin Vettori. And so you just do it. And now I know I saw on Tuesday or maybe even Wednesday after Bo got that win, Casey Layden said, if you're somebody in the top 3, top 5 of this division that's looking for a fight, I'd call out Bo Nickal. And he said, if you're Marvin Vettori, why don't you do it? I agree with Casey 100%. Casey's smart. Casey's a good dude. He understands this sport in a lot of ways. I agree 100%. If you're Marvin Vettori, I'd just say, look, Bo Nickal thinks he's this good. Come get some. Come and get it. Because look, if Bo Nickal beats you, then it's just, hey, this might be the best prospect that's come into the UFC since John Jones. It's easy to just say, look, this is a 3-time national champion wrestler, and he is the real deal, capital R, capital D. I took my shot, and this kid's just better than me. And if you beat him, then you beat this guy that, I thought he was supposed to come out and smash everybody. And you've got this great big win over a guy that had a ton of hype. But if I'm the UFC, I don't necessarily want to do that because I want to protect him a little bit. I want to just make sure. I want to bring him along, but I don't want to, as I said, I don't want it to be 5 fights before we're getting into some real tests. I want the second fight in the UFC to be the test. And if he passes that one, then the third fight needs to be a bigger test, a better test, right? We saw it. I think of Chimaev, really, who is somebody that has gotten this accelerated push and this rapid rise to an extent in the UFC, right? The first two fights, John Phillips, Reese McKee, blow through him. Great. Then it's GM3. Then it was going to be Leon Edwards, right? That was going to be the next one. You beat Gerald Meerschaert. Now here's a top 5 fighter in the welterweight division. Away you go. That kind of feels like what I want to see for maybe not top 3, top 5, or a guy in Leon's position. I didn't like that fight at the time because I felt Leon had done enough. But and that didn't end up happening, and it ended up being Li Jingliang that he ended up fighting. And that sort of feels like the progression I want to see for Bo Nickal. If he goes out and smashes Jamie Pickett, which, as I said, I think happens, give him GM3, and if he wins that one, get him in there with somebody that's in that lower third of the rankings. Get him in there with Darren Till, Kelvin Gastelum, Brad Tavares, Chris Curtis. One of these guys, Joaquin Buckley, if he beats Chris Curtis. Somebody in that range so that we can get a read on him. Get him in there with Sean Strickland. Win or lose against Jared Cannonier. At some point, we got to know. And this division is in such a state that we need to just be moving these people forward at a greater speed than we have lately, right? You look at someone like Andre Petrovsky or Michał Oleksiejczuk. Petrovsky's got 3 straight wins in the UFC. He's looked very good. He choked out Nick Maximov last time out. And he's booked against Wellington Turman, which, sure, it's an okay fight. It's not, if you're watching the video, you could see me making these faces and scrunching up my shoulders because it's just like, what are we doing? It just feels like another half step. Why are we taking half steps? We don't have time for half steps. These athletes have such a short lifespan and such a short window of opportunity to be able to capitalize. And I agree that it's getting longer. Like, it's not, hey, everybody's got 8 years. It's now stretched out to probably 12. And so if you're talking 25 through 37 to compete, but I don't want to see guys spend 27 through 30 or 31 in a whole bunch of fights if they're having success. Now, if there's losses in there and they got to take a step back, fine. But Andre Petrovsky's won his 3 UFC fights. And he's taken little steps up already. So instead of just taking another half step and facing a guy like Wellington Turman, why can't he face someone like Anthony Hernandez? Someone like Puna Soriano? Someone like, the returning Edmund Shabazian? Now, Edmund's on 3 straight losses, so I get wanting to get him in there and get him a victory and see what's what and let him figure things out. But like, if he goes out, so if Petrosky goes out and beats Wellington Turman and makes it 4-0 in the UFC, and another victory for that John Marquez, Daniel Gracie team in Philly, shout out to those guys. It can't be a half step. It's got to be a step up. It's got to be a full step forward. It's got to be up into that sort of Gregory Rodriguez, Chidi and Jokawani range where that fight took place. It's got to be into the Caio Bahayo, Mahmoud Muradov range. Or, Roman Dolidze, Phil Hawes, the winner of that. It's got to be something like that. Because there's just not time. This division is such a mess that we've got to get away from this fight the next guy in front of you mentality. And it's not just at middleweight. It is across multiple divisions. We talked about it all the way back in March that Arnold Allen calling out Calvin Kattar sucked because it was going to be the fight that ended up happening. And here we are, right? We understood it from Arnold's perspective because that's what you see. And that seems to be what happens. And now that's what happened. And it sucks because he's won 9 straight fights and he's got to fight the guy that's 1 spot ahead of him in the rankings. which means you go out and smash Calvin Kattar, or you go out and even just beat Calvin Kattar, because it's hard to smash Calvin Kattar because Cal's tough as shit. But if you go out and push it to 10 straight wins, it still may not be a title fight. And that stuff has to stop happening. We have to stop having Derek Brunson come off a loss and face Jack Hermansson coming off a win, and they're number 6 or number 5 and number 8 in the division, or whatever they're at right now. It doesn't do us any good. It doesn't help anybody. There used to be a time, and this isn't to get all super nostalgic and long for the days of Joe Silva, because you talk to enough fighters, they'll tell you some of the downsides of working with Joe Silva. But you didn't often have fighters coming off losses, fighting someone coming off a victory, especially not as we got into contention and close to the title picture, because he understood, and the goal was always to move someone forward. Whoever comes out of this moves forward and becomes a name that can compete, that can challenge against the few people in front of them. That's not the case with very many people at middleweight right now. And that has to change. And it has to change in this division. It has to change in every division, because we can't just keep making the road to contention extremely long for these young fighters that are working their way forward. And we can't continue to make it as difficult as humanly possible to where they're facing 6, 7, 8 fight winning streaks against tough, experienced competition in order to get close and maybe still not even get a championship opportunity. If you go out and win 4, 5, 6 fights consecutively in the UFC, that's got to be enough, because it's hard. I know I say it all the time, but it's with good reason. If winning 5 consecutive fights in the UFC was easy, more people would be on 5 fight winning streaks. And so if winning 5 is difficult, imagine how hard it is to win 7, 8, 9, like Arnold Allen has, or more. We can't keep extending the road. We can't keep making the journey longer, because we end up in situations like this where I have no idea who Robert Whittaker should fight. And I have no idea what to do with the winner of the Jared Cannonier-Sean Strickland fight, because they've fought everybody. Most everybody in the top 10 of this division has already fought each other, because we've just done this cannibalizing thing where we're going through the same sets of matchups, and everybody's got to face Rob, and then everybody's got to face Cannonier or Brunson or whoever it may be. It's time to find a way to refresh this. That might be Khamzat Chimaev if he can get one good win. That might be elevating somebody like Jack Hermansson a little bit sooner than you normally would, or Andre Muniz a little bit quicker than maybe you would want to, or off a victory that isn't as dynamic and important necessarily, or meaningful. Significant is the word I'm looking for, as you normally would, as you would like to see, as we all would like to see. But we don't have that luxury right now at middleweight. We can't just keep asking everyone that's trying to get into the title picture, every hopeful, to do more every time. We can't constantly say, I need you to win one more. Because then we end up in a situation where if Israel Adesanya wins this title fight on November 12th, I have no idea what's next for him. There's no one right now that has a real strong case for a championship fight. And I don't think you should ever get to a point where a championship fight is on the horizon and you can't make a case. You can't look at who is next. That fight's a month away. That fight is 5 weeks away. And I have no clue when that fight is done, if Izzy gets his hand raised, who will be next in line to fight him. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't be a situation we're ever in. There should always be something in line, something in the pipe on the same sort of trajectory, in the same sort of realm, or already established for that matter, that we know that what's going to happen, because it keeps interest. It gets you interested in the next thing coming. The UFC needs to get back to doing a better job of getting people invested in the people that are coming forward and giving those athletes opportunities to move forward, to shine, to ascend the rankings and the hierarchy quicker than they have been, and without facing as many ridiculously hard challenges as many of them have had to at this point. That's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow. We got some stuff we're working on this week. I promise you, I talked about it a little bit on Sunday. Reached out to a couple people. We're trying to put together a couple interviews, try to do a couple things here on the AV network that are a little different, that expand things a little bit, that give you some different content, some different insights. Hopefully going to be able to put a couple of those together this week. If not, I'll just be back here ranting and raving about whatever crosses my mind, or tackling whatever challenge Harry presents to me next. As always, I appreciate you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in, for subscribing, for supporting. You're all the best. And I hope you have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. We'll talk to you. God bless. See you in a bit.